Today, Wednesday, December 18th, is International Migrants Day, a day to raise awareness about the challenges and difficulties for migrants today. We're going to talk more about this now in detail with my guest, Mark Storella, a professor at Boston University. Mark, you were also a U.S. Foreign Service officer for more than 3 decades. You're a former ambassador, and you were also Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Refugees and Migration. So you're well placed to talk about all of this with us. Thanks for joining us. If you would, just to start, can you give us the layout of the situation today for migrants around the world?
Sure. First, migration is one of the mega trends of this century. It's a phenomenon that we're going to be dealing with for the rest of the century. Right now, about 281 million people are migrants in the world. That means they've crossed borders. But that's normal. That's orderly. Those are people going for jobs and education and so forth. But what's really impressive is the number of forcibly displaced, people who are persecuted, fleeing conflict, and who are leaving their homes because they must. And that number now stands, according to UNHCR, at 117 million in the world. And that's up from just 33 million just 10 years ago. So the number keeps going up, and generally, refugees aren't going home. One of the things that's most important about this is that most of these refugees are being generated from conflicts in just 4 countries, Afghanistan, Iran, Venezuela, and Syria, which is one of the most important conflicts generating refugees and displacement within its own country.
So given that that's where the biggest crises are, as you mentioned, would you say that all refugees around the world are treated the same? I mean, when there's a lot of international focus, a lot of media focus on those 4 countries that you mentioned, what about all of the other refugees around the world?
So I'm afraid I have to say absolutely not. Refugees are treated differently depending on their circumstances, where they are, and what attention the international community pays to them. So for instance, the international community has generated something over $28 billion in humanitarian assistance in the last year. But certain crises, like the crisis in Ukraine, attract most of that attention, and especially because those crises are close to countries that are big donors, like Germany and France and the United States. So there's a lot going on in just a few places. If you go to countries that are farther from the centers that are generating all this donor money, mostly in Africa, frequently those folks receive very little assistance from the international community. And they don't have even basics. They don't even have food and shelter frequently. So really, there's a huge difference amongst refugees in different places. I would also add that there's a difference in the way countries treat refugees. Frequently, some countries will provide lots of assistance. Turkey is doing a fantastic job with Syrian refugees, but other countries are unable to. Lebanon has done a great job within its means, but has very few means to support refugees.
You were talking earlier about some of these countries that aren't getting the spotlight at all. I mean, which countries are most at risk of slipping through the cracks, so to speak? I mean, which migrant crises have been the most forgotten?
You know, the international community has to prioritize where it will spend its attention. I worked hard on the Rohingya refugee crisis in Bangladesh and Myanmar. Those refugees fled over 1 million, and initially there was an enormous outpouring of support for them. But now that support is beginning to dwindle. What we see is that the appeals put out by the United Nations, which were initially funded at something like 80% of what was required, are now dwindling down to more like 40% of what is required. If we look at a lot of the crises in Africa, including Sudan, which is an emerging mega crisis, the support is even less. And in many of those cases, it's hard to get to those locations as well. So we have some important trends going on in terms of the level of support for migrants around the world, but also really big political trends that are affecting the way people look at migrants and refugees.
About that, I mean, looking toward the future, how could those trends, the politics of today, affect the future of migration?
One of the things that we're seeing, whether in the United States or in Europe, or for that matter, in India, in Turkey, and other parts of the world, is an increasing level of identification with nationalism and borders. It is most striking that Donald Trump, in 2015, when he announced his campaign, the main plank of that campaign was about the problem of migration. And he ran on that again this year and was elected. In Europe, we saw Angela Merkel make a decision to admit 1 million Syrian refugees. And shortly after that, for a number of reasons, not just that, She was no longer chancellor. And now the European Union is itself putting together a new pact on migrants and asylum seekers, which is more restrictive. So we're seeing a populist movement against refugees and migrants around the world, and that is leading to borders that are harder to cross and the likelihood that there will be less support for refugees who are in sometimes absolutely urgent need.
You mentioned a moment ago Syria. Obviously, the war there provoked one of the biggest refugee crises we've seen in recent years. I mean, what kind of implications might there be from now on in regard to migration following the end of the Assad regime?
Mm-hmm. The end of the Assad regime has been greeted everywhere with great relief and, in many cases, joy. But we're all wondering what will come next. In the case of Syria, I know Syrian refugees who are saying, we'd like to go back. And I've heard from friends who are in the region who said that after the fall, they saw cars streaming into Syria from surrounding countries, presumably representing refugees. Right now, we're seeing a debate inside the European Union already about whether this change means that refugees inside the European Union should be sent back to Syria. According to the High Commissioner for Refugees and the Refugee Convention as it is interpreted, we generally say refugees should not go back unless it's voluntary, safe, and in dignity. That might be a high bar in a case like Syria where the country is so broken. Nevertheless, there will be a strong push by the refugees themselves to return, but probably by surrounding governments, including Turkey and Lebanon, and perhaps the European Union, to see refugees go back.
Mark, thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us on this World Migration Day. Mark Storella at Boston University. Thank you.
Thanks very much.